Hello, everyone. Dr. Diego Sanchez-Ancochea is a professor of political economic development at Oxford University. He is the director of the Oxford Department of International Development, and he is here with us today to talk about the Venezuela crisis. How are you? And thank you so much for attending our invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be with you.
Okay, so just let's jump to the first question. Why has Venezuela, despite its vast oil reserves, gone from being one of Latin America's richest countries to one of its, unfortunately, poorest?
I think it's a combination of at least 3 or 4 factors. The first is policy mismanagement. So there were policies that were adopted in the last 20 years that were not the most effective to transform the economy, not the most effective to promote diversification. The second is external influences, and especially the sanctions that were imposed by the European Union and by the United States created a lot of problems for the Venezuelan economy. And then the third is that as an oil exporter, the country depends a lot on the evolution of prices, and the fact that we had oil prices, low oil prices meant that it was harder for the economy to grow. So, like many other times in development, I think it's a combination of internal and external forces that have led to this very negative outcome. So the oil was discovered in 1920. There was a period from the 1940s to the 1970s which was very successful for the country, with a lot of economic growth, partly because oil prices were high. The problem is that those benefits from growth were not very well distributed among the population, and poverty remained high, and the poor were very dissatisfied with the model and with the policies, and that's why they voted in favor of Hugo Chavez, and why Hugo Chavez was elected. And then the 3 problems that I described about economic mismanagement, sanctions, and low prices are very much referred to the problems in the last 20 years.
What is Chavismo?
In 1999, Hugo Chavez was elected president with a new platform that was a populist platform that put a lot of emphasis on distributing income as quickly as possible to the very poor and to the poor. And that led to a whole movement of people and a whole party, the Chavista party, that was very much wanting to continue to maintain his policies over the long run.
I see. And how long has Maduro governed? And what impact have his main economic policies, on Venezuela?
He became president when Hugo Chavez died in 2013. So he has been president for 12 years. And the problem is he maintained many of the policies, but with oil prices that were much lower. And that made those policies quite unsustainable, because the government was spending much more than it was receiving as revenues, and that created a very high public deficit and created increasing tensions on the economy. So I think the management that in the Maduro administration has not been particularly effective.
Dr. Anchoel, may I call you Diego?
Yes, please.
Okay, Dr. Diego, is Maduro a brutal dictator?
I think he has been in the last few years. I don't think Hugo Chavez was, to be very clear. I think which one distinguished the 2 periods of government, but since his election as president, I think Maduro has become increasingly a dictator and has adopted increasingly hard policies against the opposition. Also, one of the other things to think that he's a dictator is that there's enough evidence to show that he didn't win the elections in 2024, but he didn't respect the results and decided to stay in power despite losing those elections.
And to be fair to President Trump, he's being accused of actually kidnapping. Some people are actually accusing him, and even some part of the legal establishment of kidnapping. This removal was actually a kidnap of Nicolas Maduro. Was it?
So I think it was because even if there's reasons to change presidents and to try to promote democracy in Venezuela, I think there's two reasons why I would say that one could call it a kidnapping. The first is that the reasons that he was detained have nothing to do with all the barbarities that he has committed in power, but are about drug trafficking, and there's not a lot of evidence that he's actually a drug trafficker or he's the leader of a drug ring, as they claim. The second is that I think it's very problematic, and it creates a very worrying precedent when a country decides to take out another president by force. I think that creates a very difficult precedent in terms of international relations.
What do you think of President Trump's policies regarding Venezuelan oil the day after removal of Maduro's?
It's still early to say because the administration is making very contradictory comments about what that policy will be. For example, if the policy involves more room for exporting oil without sanctions, I think that will be positive. At the same time, I think the idea that the U.S. will get most of the gains from Venezuelan oil is non-acceptable because these are natural resources from the country. So in my ideal world, there would be a elimination of sanctions. There will be a support of the Venezuelan public companies so it can become more effective at exploiting oil, but oil will remain in the hands of Venezuelans.
What is, in your opinion, Venezuela's economic outlook, and how might the government respond to prevent further decline?
If it eliminates sanctions and it allows exports from Venezuela again, I think things could improve a little in the next few months. Partly also because the capacity for production should also increase, and this would be positive. However, if Venezuela has to deal with sanctions for the future, then I think the situation is very complicated because the country is already facing high levels of inflation. It's already facing difficulties to store oil, and with the sanctions, those difficulties and the hyperinflation will become even more problematic.
The state of the narco-trafficking flow between the United States and Latin America now. Can you just briefly comment on this?
So I think it's clearly a problem, but it's a problem that has much less to do with Venezuela than with Colombia and Central American countries. Colombia is the big producer of narcotics, and Central America is the big passing area for narcotics in the region. So, and this is obviously a problem, but it's of course a problem that has to be solved both in terms of supply but in terms of demand as well, right? The demand in the US should go down, and the government should adopt different policies to try to make a reduction in drug consumption in the US at the same time as new policies about supply are implemented.
Just in reality, is the vice president of Maduro in charge of the Venezuelan country or not?
She is, but of course, what we don't know yet is what will be the restrictions in terms of U.S. policy and where she will be able to adopt the policies that she wants and where it will have to make the U.S. Content. But I do think that she still has some degrees of freedom, and that she will have to carefully manage the whole Chavista coalition, and that will be a complicated role in its own right.
And now our last question: what are the main reasons that keep many Latin American countries less wealthy than the United States? And in other words, why is Latin America so poor compared to the United States?
A difficult question that depends on a lot of factors, but I think it connects very nicely, Hava, with the question that we started with what were the problems in Venezuela. I think we need to think about the problems in Latin America in terms of internal and external factors. Internally, the problem is that the region is very unequal. And as I have tried to show in a book that I published in 2020, The Cost of Inequality, these very high levels of inequality create a lot of economic, social, and political problems in the region. The second set of factors is external. The influence of the US has actually been very negative in Latin America. This last decision by the Trump administration is just one in a long history of intervention of the US in Latin America. So it's the combination of these difficulties internally and these constraints externally, the ones that create problems for economic growth and economic development in the region. I mean especially that the rich are very rich. So one thing that happens in Latin America is that the top 1% receive around 30% of everything that is being produced in the country. This is more than in any other country in the world. And 1% receives around 30% of everything that is being produced in countries like Chile, in countries like Brazil. And this is actually one of the highest levels of concentration in the very rich in the whole world.
Do you blame immigration, basically, or there are economic factors in the United States that are contributing to this Latinization economically of the United States?
Absolutely. I'm glad that you say that expression because it's one that I have used in the book that I told you about, The Cost of Inequality, very much in which I try to show how the US in particular is looking more and more like Latin America, and that the very high inequality in the US is what explains things like the election of Trump, and is what explains many of the economic, social, and political problems that the US is experiencing. So I think in the US, we do very well of learning and studying the experience of Latin America, because this might be what is coming to that country. Immigration has very little to do with it, and I think it has a lot to do with the policies that the governments have implemented since the 1980s. For example, the very significant reduction of taxes, less accent on competition policy, and also it has to do with the type of technological innovation, right? The new technologies around the internet and around now artificial intelligence have created a whole group of very rich people and have created more inequality. So I think it's the combination of economic policies and the economic model much more than migration what explains inequality in the US.
What would you say as a personal, as advisor to the president at this moment?
Never try to advise Trump, it's too difficult, but let me try in any case. I think I would say first, try to eliminate sanctions, allow the country to export oil. Second, work together with the Venezuelan government to allow them to implement policies. But third, at the same time, discuss with them a policy to come back to elections and to celebrate truly free elections in the next few years, because I think that will be important for the country as well.
Thank you. And let's hope for the best. Let's hope for the best.
Let's hope for the best in these very complicated times. Thank you for the invitation.